Man. Wow, it was loud. Good afternoon, guys. It is my honor, as I consider it, to wrap up this series that we've been going through Nehemiah. And we've learned a lot so far, and it's interesting to me that we can work through this. And I'd like to start off this by telling you a story, and as piggybacking on Calvin, let's say that it's very similar to a fight. Because when I was younger, you wouldn't know it by looking at me, but I was really into karate. I loved karate before I started playing music and focusing on preaching, or at least trying to preach and teach. I loved and would give my whole self to karate. And I remember one specific event was a tournament that I had. And in these tournaments, it's not like a UFC thing, which you guys might be familiar with, but it's more like a decathlon. You have different events that you can participate in. There are forms, which are open hand forms, which is a system of movements that you're judged on, your intensity and form and things. You have weapons forms, which are with swords and daggers. I've seen with scythes, which are really neat to watch when people do them well. Board breaking, which is also incredibly neat. There's a lot of wood afterwards, but it's really fun to watch. And one of my favorite events, and one of my better events, was sparring. You could see that I was kind of practicing, and I got a little cut up earlier from practicing. But I remember one time that we had a local tournament, and in this event, that my opponent and I, we never met before, but we faced off and shook hands with one another and bowed out of a sign of respect, and then we took up our positions, our fighting stance. And so he got into his and I got into mine. And this is a pretty strong stance. I have my fists ready for action. I have my hand up to guard my head, and my hand down here to guard my body and my chest. And as we started to circle around one another. And we started to feel each other out as fights often go. And in the first few minutes, we learned a few things about each other. I learned that my feet were a little bit faster than his hands, so that was a good thing for me. And I learned that I had better reach on him, so I stayed at a distance. And pretty soon we started to score points, and as I gained to get a little bit in the lead, but when I did that, my stance relaxed. And so as the match continued to go on and I get farther and farther ahead, my defense got lower and lower and lower, until finally I was just going through the motions. Have you guys ever let your guard down? And what happens when we do let our guard down? What happened for me when I let my guard down was as soon as my hands dropped, I get a foot right in my chest. And I was unable to recover from that, and I ended up losing the match just because I let my hands drop. If you guys will turn with me to Nehemiah 13, the last chapter of Nehemiah. I kind of wish that I could tell you that this story has a happy ending. That the people, Nehemiah and the Jews right now, they have done so many good things on faith. If I could just catch you up to where we are in the narrative so far. You know that Nehemiah came from Susa to Jerusalem, and you know that he faced opposition, and even in this opposition he built the wall, and the wall was completed in no time at all. And we know that they dedicated the wall to God. In Calvin, he taught us that the people rededicated themselves. And where we are right here in this narrative and in this story is that Nehemiah's time in the Holy Land is up. He has to go back to where he has to go back to Susa. And while he is still in Susa and the other people that he is left in charge of, some things start to happen. I think the people let their guard down. And since they let their guard down because they got comfortable, some things started to happen. If you'll turn with me we're just going to kind of look at a bird's eye view at first to see some of the problems that were going on. Let's look at verse 4. It says, before this, Elishabib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms, remember the storerooms that we talked about earlier, of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But that wasn't it. We had a man living in the house of God, a mortal man living in the house of God. But that wasn't all. If you look in verse 10, it says, I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. But that's not all, if you go in verse 15. In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Yet that wasn't it. There's still other problems that were going on if we look in verse 23 and 24. Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. That's some heavy stuff. It's interesting to think that these people who had just dedicated themselves to God, who had just reaffirmed their covenant just a chapter and a half later, were breaking it again. The same things that they were doing back then that they had reformed themselves of, they had followed back into that same pattern of behavior. They went back to desecrating the Sabbath and working on the Sabbath. They were robbing and they were filling up their own storehouses. Tobiah, who was living in the house of God. They went back to marrying women of other peoples of the land. And I think it's because they had done so many things in faith. They had done all these great things that they had their guard up. They were ready while they were doing all these things, but they got comfortable. And so they let their guard down. And when they let their guard down, they were exposed to all these different problems, to lust, and to greed. I can't help but wonder, when we let our guard down in our own lives, that how often we do this ourselves. We think we have our stuff together. We think we have our baggage in check. But it might not be the case. See, sometimes I can just see ourselves putting ourselves in situations that we probably shouldn't have. Maybe it's those conversations that we have late at night, or inappropriate friendships that we have. It's the kind of friendships that we have that we sneak away early in the morning to go see, or late at night. It's the kind of friendships that we say, oh, we're going to Starbucks or Steak and Shake, and instead of going to those places, we go see this other person. Perhaps it's when we go home and when we're still awake at early hours of the morning and our mind wanders back to those times. and the things that we did on other sleepless nights. Maybe we think we have our guard up, but we get comfortable and we lower our guard in our schoolwork. That we have those one or two classes that we feel are easy, and we think we have a handle on it, and so we just kind of let it slide until it just catches up with us and we find ourselves falling farther and farther behind. Maybe we feel like we have our guard up and we say that we have our stuff together and we're doing well spiritually, but then we find ourselves attending Bedside Baptist more and more often. One way that a particularly painful example for me of how I thought I had my guard up was around this time a while ago. And I thought I had my baggage in check. I thought that the things that I was dealing with, my loneliness and how hard it was to have a long distance relationship, I thought I had that in check. And I let my guard down around some people. And because of that, I was hurt. And there were things that went on inside of me that really messed with my other relationships. It messed with my relationship with my friends. It messed with my relationship with my girlfriend, with my school and professors and schoolwork. And it messed with my relationship with God. And I'm embarrassed to admit this to you. It's because for a moment, I got comfortable and I let my guard down. And when I let my guard down, I opened myself so that I was exposed and vulnerable. Just like the people in our text. But that, fortunately enough for us, that isn't the whole story.